In this video, I'm going to rank every single Poppy Playtime monster by one single thing. How scary are they? Everybody knows Poppy Playtime is filled with both intense nightmare fuel and characters that you just want to hug. So taking every monster that we see across Poppy Playtime's 4 chapters and 1 spin-off, we'll be ranking them by nightmare fuel, horrifying, just scary, mid, and not scary at all. The rules are that the character must appear in the game as a monster, so as much as I'd want to dissect the secret horrors of Sir Poops a lot, they don't have a monster version making them unrankable, and the characters will be ranked by their design, encounters in the games, and of course their lore. But let's get right into it in order of appearance. Starting off with perhaps the most iconic character, there's Huggy Wuggy. Now, I won't go into the entire backstory of every character because I already did that in this video, but just focusing on the horror, right out of the gate, Huggy is one of Poppy Playtime's scariest characters. Firstly, his design is amazingly done for a horror game. As a toy, he looks adorable and lovable. However, scale him up to a 10-foot monster, his lanky body is super uncanny and is almost reminiscent of something like Slender Man. That being said though, the character only works if he's done justice in the game, and I'd go as far as to say that he is done basically perfectly here. After first entering the factory, we are immediately met with the uncanny statue that doesn't ever move but still strikes the player as odd. In order to reach the next room, we are forced to turn our backs to Huggy, making us feel even more vulnerable. And worse, once the power to the lobby is turned back on, Huggy mysteriously vanished. Although that doesn't mean we are alone, as Huggy appears around the factory through little blips that are barely quick enough to even make out who it is, but let the player know they are being watched. We progress through the rest of the factory and make it to this deep dark hallway that, when going down, gives Huggy the chance to attack us, forcing us into the vents and commencing the iconic chase scene with Huggy you're probably already familiar with. That isn't just scary because of the tight corners and anxiety-inducing music, but also when looking at the writing on the walls, it's described that Huggy was starving, which explains why he was chasing us like some kind of feral animal. And this is expressed perfectly in the game when he's showing his razor sharp teeth, his constant eye contact with the player no matter where they are, and seeing him cram his large body through the vents as he barrels towards us, desperate just to get a bite of food. This chase should be a case study on how to make a good scary chase scene. Plus, throughout later chapters, they even build up to the idea that Huggy might have survived the events of chapter 1 and was still haunting our mind through nightmares, leading up to chapter 4's ending, where he lunges at us through the glass, hungrier than ever. Even lore-wise, Huggy is super creepy, as we learned that during his creation, he was one of the more obedient creatures that didn't really do that much, but was prone to similar freakouts seen in the game, escaping the factory and eating everything in sight in one VHS tape. All in all, Huggy is a perfect mascot horror villain. I don't care what anyone says or about how he's portrayed in general pop culture. And I mean, we literally end up having a nightmare about him in the game, so what better tier suits him than nightmare fuel? Next, let's move on to Huggy Wuggy's counterpart, Kissy Missy. Design-wise, she's basically the same as Huggy, outside of being a different color and having eyelashes. However, while Huggy is presented in a way to make him one of the scariest characters in the entire franchise, despite his on-the-surface cute and cuddly design, Kissy Missy is the exact opposite. Anytime we see her in the game, she is there to help us, and even though they'll sometimes give her a jump scare or intimidating appearance, she is still absolutely adorable. Her animations are noticeably softer and calmer, especially when she is scared or disturbed, which make her feel much less frightening. Especially as we learned in later chapters, the reason she is so timid and jumpy isn't because she is violent in any way, but rather because ever since she was created, she was easily scared and anxious, which gives her a completely different personality to Huggy Wuggy and shows how important the execution of a character is to their horror, regardless of design. Overall, she is the most lovable character in the game, but inherently, that also makes her one of the least scary. Next, of course, we have our other quote-unquote ally, Poppy. who, like Kissy, we spend the entire game working with to traverse around the factory and discover its secrets. And in terms of horror, Poppy is a bit complicated. Design-wise, she isn't inherently that scary or even uncanny like the other two. She's just a doll. After all, if we really wanted to, we could just step on her and call it a day. Plus, like Kissy, she is usually our friend that generally has tried to help us. However, on the other side, what makes her stand out from the other more animalistic characters is that she seems to be super intelligent and more specifically manipulative. In the game, she actively manipulates the player to go deeper into the factory and help her tear it all down, while also being super selfish, abandoning us when facing the prototype in Chapter 4. This gives the impression throughout the game that Poppy can't really be trusted and is a bit of a wild card, which makes us much more skeptical of everything she says as she constantly leads us into danger, and that gives her a creepy edge, especially when we learn in the game's lore that she was the child of the factory's creator, Elliot Ludwig, that was used as the patient zero of the experiments, being forcefully dissected by scientists while still alive to learn how to eventually create the others, which gives her this traumatized, shell-shocked vibe sometimes, especially in certain scenes like after saving her in Chapter 2. Overall, while she isn't physically very intimidating at all, Poppy is super unpredictable and manipulative, which can sometimes make her kind of creepy, but overall, I'd say she's a pretty mid-tier character in terms of horror. Next, I wanted to move on to BoogieBot, or the BoogieBots. There's a couple of living BoogieBots in the physical game, both inside of the safe haven. There's Scout, the one that shuts the safe haven door at the start, and the Medic, who is a red version of BoogieBot that heals the injured toys. Obviously, in terms of horror, these characters are by no means any scary. They don't feature any scary physical traits, and they don't have much background lore-wise. This one's probably the easiest of them all. The BoogieBots are in the not scary tier. Okay, this is probably going to be my first big hot take of the video, but I don't really think the prototype is that scary, at least compared to some of the game's other monsters. Just hear me out. The prototype is a character who we've only seen a handful of times physically in the game, once in Chapter 2, twice in Chapter 3, and once more in Chapter 4, along with the encounter with him in the vents. Otherwise, we mostly hear about him through the game's lore, where they talk about him being a manipulative creature, kind of like Poppy, with extreme intelligence, that had a hatred specifically for the employees, along with seeing his full form in the way of a shrine in the Catnap's cave and the aforementioned shadow in Safe Haven. And don't get it twisted, from what we've seen, he's a very cool design and definitely is a creepy character, especially since we just know so little about him, but I don't really find him on the same level of scary as like a Huggy or Catnap, at least yet. His robotic look removes a lot of the organic uncanniness the other experiments have, and also so far, he's appeared exclusively in non-interactable cutscenes, so it's not like we've really ever had the chance to be scared of him anyway. The mystery on what he is and what he will end up doing definitely make him a good villain, a great one at that, and he does at times have some pretty creepy moments, like when he slowly drags away Mommy's corpse for an unknown reason, but he's far from one of the scariest characters in the game, and probably hovers around the lower end of the just scary tier. So, Mommy Longlegs is another one of the more complex characters when it comes to horror in my opinion, and here's why. Design-wise, she's okay. The Betty Spaghetti inspiration looks super unique, and the long stretchy hands do lead to some scary scenes physically in the game, but also, spare for a couple scenes, most of the time she is very vibrant and shiny, in a chapter that is already brighter and less cramped than any other, making it harder for her to be scary, while in most of her encounters, she spends a huge chunk of them talking and talking, most of which is pretty useless and annoying, which for a villain that's supposed to be scary, having to sit there listening to her yap away for minutes at a time makes me less intimidated by her and more annoyed. That being said though, in my opinion, the devs make up for all of this in two major ways. For one, there's her final chase scene. To show her descent into madness, her design design becomes dirtied and darker, helping her to look creepier despite her shiny design, while her chase itself is also really scary. It's a little bit long and doesn't necessarily hold a candle to the original Huggy chase, but things like her suddenly pouncing and ambushing us, having to grapple ourselves out of a pit while she chases from below, or especially at the end, having to turn on the shredder room while being forced to watch mommy inch closer and closer by the second down the hallway is super anxiety inducing. And also secondly, her lore is pretty creepy as well. Once a child that lived in Playtime Co. Marie Payne as an orphan, she went completely crazy when the red smoke was administered to her inside of Playcare, forcing them to remove her and use her as a test subject to create Mommy Longlegs. But then in retaliation, she became so violent to the employees, they had to completely segregate her from them and dedicated her to the game station to take care of the children while they watched from above. Overall, while I'm really not a fan of the way they built up Mommy Longlegs through the majority of the chapter, the more I think about it, her in-game chase sequences are thrilling and her out-of-game lore is really creepy, so much so that it negates most of the stuff that I didn't like. Which is why, while I fully intended to put her lower in this list when making this video, I think she belongs a tier below Huggy in the horrifying tier. Bunzo Bunny is the first minigame monster in Chapter 2, occupying musical memory. And at first, he honestly isn't that notable. His design is pretty basic, just a bunny with symbols and sharp teeth. It's not really something that leaves me feeling that creeped out. However, gameplay-wise, his encounter does end up being a pretty scary experience, as he inhabits musical memory, a Simon-type game, that while playing forces us to focus on remembering all the colors while merely being able to hear Bunzo and his crashing cymbals coming down on us, allowing us to kind of guess on whether he is close or not without having time to look up and see where he's actually at, which makes it all the more intense when you're trying to memorize the patterns and the sounds of his cymbals just inch closer and closer. Plus, while his in-game lore is mostly non-existent, we do have a comic book released back in 2023 that showed Bunzo searching for eggs for Easter before getting stuck in a trap and rotting away, which is a pretty creepy comic if you ask me. That being said, he's far from the top of the list, but I'd say he goes at the bottom of scary. The mini Huggies include both the Huggies and Wuggies from Chapter 2 in Project Playtime. Now, ranking these, in my opinion, is pretty simple. They have no real lore attached to them and are literally just smaller Huggies. They do have some pretty good gameplay, especially in Chapter 2 when they're overwhelming the player, but those ones don't even have teeth, so they just end up being cute plushies with a little jump scare, and so therefore there isn't really much to them, and I have to put them at the top of not scary. PJ Pugapillar is the villain of Chapter 2's statues, and in my opinion, he's probably one of the scariest parts of the entire chapter. First off, I love his design. It's cute in the right context, but when he's crawling towards us in the dark, it can be pretty creepy. And most importantly, kind of like Huggy, his encounter is done super well. In it, we play red light, green light, with the lights flickering on and off, allowing us to move in the darkness, which on its own is pretty simple, but the design of this level makes it so scary to play through for the first time, as there's multiple paths the player can choose to go down. There's these little ball pits that we can get stuck in, causing PJ to gain ground on us, and there's stuff like the slides part where we have to crawl through without seeing where PJ is behind us, at least until he's right next to us. Plus, if we mess up in this mode, PJ doesn't just jump scare us suddenly, but he beams over to our location, which is pretty startling. The encounter is unfortunately pretty easy once you realize that PJ isn't that fast. It's a bit too forgiving. Plus, he has essentially no lore outside of Marcus Brickley spotting him outside in the cafeteria, but I'd still definitely put him at the very top of the scary tier. Boxy Boo is the main villain of Project Playtime, and while I love him, I am super mixed about him as a horror character. Through the Project Playtime ARG, we learn that Boxy was the first of the bigger body monsters to be successful, and was initially created with the sole purpose of eating employees who talked bad against the company, which definitely gives him one of the more intimidating backstories, especially since we see he would attack by disguising as a box and then jumping out at the victim in one quick motion. Design-wise, I also think he's done pretty well. He's a jack-in-the-box toy who naturally has springy body parts that help him jump out at victims, and looking at some of his toy art, despite him literally being a monster, it's still believable that this could be a real toy. This being said, the big drawback with him as a character is in his in-game execution, as this design and style would have made for a perfect scripted chase sequence or something like that, where he's bouncing around or grabs us with his stretchy arms. However, he instead only appears through Project Playtime, the multiplayer game, where for obvious reasons his kit had to be more mellowed out to fit in an ASIM style, which in turn kind of ruins a lot of the scariness he would have had if he was more like the trailers. So that definitely knocks him down quite a bit, and for a character that had a lot of potential to be in the top of this list, for me, disappointingly, I have to put him in the mid tier. So now we have the Chapter 3 main antagonist, Catnap, who, memes aside, makes an argument for being one of the scariest and creepiest characters in all of mascot horror, in my opinion, rivaling even Huggy. Before even discussing anything in the game, the Catnap character was once a part of the Smiling Critters line, but had to be pulled when the mysterious red gas that was created to put test subjects to sleep inside of Playtime Co. was accidentally put into real Catnap plushes, causing vicious nightmares in children and them being recalled. Which isn't helped by the fact that in the Smiling Critters cartoon, Catnap is a silent critter who leaves the other critters almost addicted to the gas, literally screaming and begging Catnap to put them to sleep in one of the episodes. So out of the gate, just as a character, Catnap is really creepy, but the bigger body version gets even more sinister. Design-wise, he looks noticeably starved, and you can even see his ribs poking out of his skin, while his voice box was mishandled and broken, leading to him having a deep and dark voice. In terms of his encounters in the game, we learned that before becoming an experiment, Catnap was a child named Theodore, who was manipulated by the prototype into becoming his best friend and treating him like a god. So when we intrude on Playcare, Catnap lurks around the player throughout the entire chapter like some kind of hunter, never fully making himself known by peeking with his glowing eyes down dark hallways, quickly attacking other nearby toys, and sitting by doors, making a deep purring noise as he listens for us to come by. It's basically just a better version of what we saw with Huggy sneaking around in Chapter 1. It's super creepy in the best way, all building up to his main appearance at the end, where he finally ambushes us and fills the room with red smoke, forcing a boss fight against him and his many hallucinations that all attack us at once until we can zap him and the prototype takes him away. Now, I will say his boss fight is generally underwhelming gameplay wise, but in terms of horror, I still find it to be absolutely adrenaline inducing. The game forces us to slowly lower our defenses by opening up more hallways the closer we get to the end, and the timer until the fight's over is always sitting right in front of us, which for some reason makes it feel like it takes so much longer than it already does. Another thing I see people often complain about is that Catnap doesn't appear much in the game until the final boss fight, but I'd argue that's what makes him work so well, and having it any other way would be a detriment to his horror. This, along with all the religious imagery around Catnap and his obsession with the prototype up until meeting his grave, make him by far the most well thought out and scariest character in the game so far, sitting him at the top of Nightmare Fuel. Dog Day is a character that is only ever seen once in his monster form in-game, but makes the most of it to say the least. After entering the Playhouse prison, we get to see the overtaken beast, whose design mostly speaks for itself. His arms are hung up inside one of the cells, with his waist down being entirely eaten by the mini critters that roam the area. This scene is shockingly graphic for Poppy Playtime, something they've never really ever topped since, and the despair in Dog Day's voice while he describes what the prototype and the mini critters had done to the factory and his body are bone-chilling, especially when it ends with him getting eaten from the inside out and chasing us through one of the better chase scenes in the game as his recontrolled body crawls towards us. Overall, Dog Day isn't quite as scary as a Catnap or Huggy, mostly because his appearance is very short, but he makes a good argument for what would be the scariest part of the entire game, definitely putting him at the bottom of the Nightmare Fuel list. Miss Delight, like the many other Chapter 3 characters, is another example of a character done right in nearly every way. She was originally designed to be this approachable, friendly teacher alongside her many sisters, but following the Hour of Joy, after getting trapped in the school, she ended up going insane and ate all of her peers, giving her the crazy design we see in-game, which perfectly encapsulates her descent into madness with her torn apart face and her inanimate companion she called Barb. That was also her weapon of choice. In-game, her encounter is one of my favorites because after entering the school, we lose signal with Ollie, leaving us stranded. And throughout the school, we can find notes describing Miss Delight's disturbing descent into craziness, only to see her roaming the halls as we keep moving, and hearing her threaten us on the intercom system, leading up to the generator that, after powering on, causes her to finally attack us and break it, starting another intense chase scene exiting the school while she chases us Weeping Angel style, which is a popular horror cliche, but it is for a good reason. Having to turn our backs to Miss Delight while completing these mini puzzles to open the doors makes things much more scary, and it was even better in the original version of Chapter 3, where when the lights flickered in the halls, she would run after us regardless of if we were looking at her or not, intensifying the horror further. Then at the end, we get stuck in this little room, having to power on the classrooms on the sides to eventually open up the exit door, while Miss Delight circles around us just feet away, which forces us to get up close and personal with the creature in a way that works very well, only to finally open the exit and have one final rundown with her where we can slam the gate on her body, officially marking the end. In my opinion, Miss Delight rivals Dog Day for being the best side character horror-wise, at least so far, with the only real complaints being that they made her much easier in the final version, and that while I think her design is executed well and works for the lore like I mentioned before, I just personally prefer the more abstract designs of the other characters over the humanoid doll we got here. But to me, none of that'll put her any lower than the top of horrifying. I'm considering the mini critters to be every version we see of them in the game. The smiling critters, the nightmare critters, the ones in the playhouse, the prison, the safe haven, all of them are going to be counted here. And so I'm honestly unsure how to feel about them. On one hand, sometimes their appearances in game at least try to be scary. Like in Chapter 3, they're mindless latching onto anything to get a bite to eat, especially in the case of Dog Day, is definitely a pretty creepy premise. But on the other hand, they're also extremely small and in most cases don't even try to be intimidating. Rather, they're actually quite cute. They don't really have much lore. They're kind of just filler characters to represent the leftover civilians in the lost world of Playtime Co. And so sometimes they're scary, a lot of the times they're not, which in my opinion puts them right around the lower end of mid-tier. Harley Sawyer is another character similar to the prototype who I like and I know a lot of other people like, but that I don't really find that scary, even more so than the prototype. Starting as one of the Playtime Co. employees, Harley became twisted and eventually was turned into this computer system to try and limit his powers, later on taking control after the Hour of Joy and building up into the character we see in the game. In terms of design, I don't even know how to rank him because on one hand we have have his minions that are a little creepy, or just the entire computer system in general that in the lore is meant to be always watching us, personified as this weird eye, which also on its own has a creepy touch. Either way, no matter how you rank the design, the biggest issue Harley faces is that for as intimidating and creepy as he is in the lore, being the creator of the experiments only to be overthrown in agony as this robot watching over us, all that creepy stuff, in the game, the devs don't really ever seem to capitalize on all that buildup that much. Because outside of the occasional monologue and whatnot, we only ever physically encounter him during his boss fight with all of the minions. That was very underwhelming in terms of horror. They move so wonky that it's almost funny and have to hit the player multiple times, so even if you do get stuck with them, it's rare for them to actually jump scare you or anything. The only real scary part of this boss fight is the part where one of the minions stops you in your path and beams down the hallway, but otherwise we then just make it to Harley Sawyer's center console, grab the Omni chip, and after a scripted cutscene, he just dies. Overall, if you're a lore junkie, Harley is one of the most intriguing and disturbing characters still, which is great, but he also has maybe the least intimidating boss fight of any character ranked so far. So while I wouldn't go as far as to put him in the mid tier, he's at the very bottom of scary, and even that feels super generous. Next, we have Yarnaby, the face-spitting rainbow hairball. Now, Yarnaby, design-wise, in my opinion, is a complete hit. He looks like such a cute little guy until he splits his face open sideways and reveals a mouthful of sharp teeth, which is such a clever design, and if you watched the original Chapter 4 Yarnaby trailer when it released, I'm sure you remember the jaw drop you had when Yarnaby was revealed and proceeded to split his head in two. His lore is also pretty creepy, once being an innocent child named Quinn Navidson, who was manipulated by the doctor into becoming dependent on him like a dog, before disappearing when turned into the computer, leaving him heartbroken. At least until we learn in Chapter 4 that they reunited and Yarnaby was tasked to hunt us down, which perfectly segues into his encounters in the game, which at least in my opinion are done pretty well horror-wise. He is consistently pretty scary, especially this part where after climbing into the vent, he launched up to it and starts biting at us, which scared the absolute crap out of me my first time playing it. Or what about when he's leaning and scratching up on this fence here and proceeds to knock it down and blast out of the room? They're small startles, but since he's always lurking around, they're super effective. Also, for as much as I hate it on a gameplay level, the no man's land part of the game where we have to power on and exit while Yarnaby's AI lurks around looking for us is admittedly pretty scary. Having to listen for his stomps or screams can be pretty unsettling. His chase scenes are unfortunately pretty disappointing. He has two, but both are literally just run forward with no real extra challenge. And overall, he isn't a top tier character, but I definitely put him comfortably into horrifying. When originally drawing up this video a few months ago, I was going to put Pianosaurus pretty high up in the list, because in the game's lore, he is described as this savage beast that behaved like a wild animal, which is reminiscent of Huggy Wuggy, while his design is pretty creepy too. But of course, as you know, in Chapter 4, he only ever appears in one cinematic cutscene, and we would later on learn through some comics that Pianosaurus actually was just a misunderstood monster that saw the world as bright and colorful, unknowingly killing the creatures he encountered. So now, when playing the game, if anything, I just feel bad for him. I'm sorry, Pianosaurus, not scary. Baba Chops is the one nightmare critter I'm ranking separately because she appears as an individual boss in Chapter 4. But that being said, like her mini critter counterparts, I don't end up finding her that scary. Her design is pretty solid, and controversially, I actually think her fight is a lot of fun gameplay wise, but her lore is non-existent, and with her being super small and just constantly lunging at the player's feet spitting this green goo, it feels more reminiscent of what it's like to own a small dog rather than a horror game character. Baba Chops is not scary. Doughy the Doughman is an extremely interesting character to rank here, because on the surface, he couldn't be less scary. I mean, he's literally just a blob of Play-Doh with a U2's face slapped on it, and he is even our friend for most of the chapter. But at the same time, we learn throughout the game's lore that he was actually 3 separate children turned into one being, all with different personalities. Some kind, some childish, some angry. And Doughy features in one of the most horrifying VHS tapes in the entire game, where after the parents of one of the children that became Doughy was brought to Playtime Code to see their child brought back to life after an accident in the factory, he switched to his angry personality and killed them both while the employees locked the observation room from the outside.
Open this door!
In the games, we end up seeing this personality shift multiple times, which can make him unpredictable, and of course at the end we see him turn into the salamander for the final boss fight. But with that being said, while Doughy is undeniably an amazing character, he does leave me mostly feeling bad for him more than ever really being scared of him. The only instance where he really tries to be creepy is in that final chase and battle, but the salamander design is so over the top that it loses a lot of the horror effect, and plus during the entire battle we hear him constantly crying out of misery. So while I definitely think he has a lot of parts about him that make him creepy and sometimes scary, he is far from competing with the other 3 chapters' banner characters, so he has to go just in the scary tier. So that's every Poppy Playtime monster ranked by horror. Now, disclaimer, this is obviously just my opinion, and even at that, the exact rankings of all the monsters change slightly depending on how I'm feeling on any given day, so it's not meant to be taken that seriously, although I can't wait to read the comments, and if you have any input or want to tell me my tier list is terrible, let me know in the comments below. I'll talk to you guys later.